Hello everyone, and welcome to the third Real Lecture of 2020. To begin, we would like to acknowledge the Wathaurong people of the Kulin Nation and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Tonight's guest is Jefa Greenaway, the Principal Architect of Greenaway Architects. Jefa Greenaway is a University of Melbourne senior academic of 2 decades standing, founding director of Greenaway Architects and a regular design commentator on ABC Radio Melbourne. He's championed Indigenous-led thinking for over 25 years as a registered architect in New South Wales and Victoria, including as a co-founder of Indigenous Architecture and Design Victoria, as co-author of the International Indigenous Design Charter, and as regional ambassador of Indigo, the International Indigenous Design Network. He's a founding signatory of Architects Declare Australia, an initiative for grounding architecture's role into tackling the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss, is co-curator with Tristan Wong of the Australian exhibition at La Biennale Architectura di Venezia 2020, the Venice Biennale, and was recently inducted into the Design Institute of Australia's 2020 Hall of Fame and included with the Qantas 100 Inspiring Australians. Jefa sits on numerous boards and advisory panels, including the State Design Review panels in New South Wales and Victoria, the Public Arts Advisory Panel, City of Melbourne, and design juries for the AIA, PIA, AILA, and is currently an ambassador for the 2020 Sustainability Awards. Tonight, Jefa will be taking us through a lecture entitled The Time is Now for Black Design, as part of this trimester's overarching theme of sustainability. We'd also like to note for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers, just a warning that the following program may contain images and voices of deceased persons. Before we get started, as this is the third lecture back for 2020 and possibly the first for many of our visitors tonight, I'll give a quick explanation to who we are and why we do what we do. The Real Lectures are a series of student-organised industry lectures featuring practicing architects and industry professionals. The Real Lectures were established in order to pursue engaging, topical, and thought-provoking architectural discourse. You can stay up to date with us on our social media platforms and on our blog. And if you'd like to see more of the Real Lectures, you can see previous recorded ones on our Facebook page and blog. Now, without further ado, I'll hand over to Jefa to give his lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So this evening, I'd just like to take you on a bit of a journey which is very much a personal story and a bit of a narrative arc of my experience through architecture. And so I've titled this presentation, The Time is Now for Black Design, Cultural Sustainability for 3,000 plus generations. So my relationship to sustainability is a multifaceted, holistic approach. And so, as is cultural protocol, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which I'm gathering, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that we're on the unceded sovereign lands of the Kulin Nation. And to that end, it's always important to introduce oneself and explain who's your mob and where you're from. So, using the language of my country, which is Walwong Kamilaroi country, Yama, or welcome. And for those who are not familiar, Indigenous Australia represents a non-monolithic understanding of culture and language. And so to that end, what we see through this map of Aboriginal Australia is a rich diversity, a rich tapestry of over 250 language groups and 600 distinct dialects. And so what that really demonstrates is that rich mosaic of many voices and many languages and many cultures. And so you can see here, my country is Walwong Kamilaroi, which is northwest New South Wales. It's actually the second largest language group in New South Wales after Wiradjuri. And so you can see this better through the Tyndale map, which demonstrates here the relationship from where I'm from to where I'm currently located and where I've lived a large proportion of my life. And as is often the case, Indigenous people share a bicultural experience. And so I come from an Aboriginal father and a German mother. And so my father really links through time. So my father was actually born 6 years after Federation. So he's a significant figure in Aboriginal history. He was there back in the National Day of Mourning in 1938. He signed up as a soldier in the Second World War. He spent over a decade lobbying for the 1967 referendum, which enabled Indigenous people to be counted as citizens of their own nation. He was mentored by such figures as William Cooper, but in turn he mentored other Indigenous figures like Charlie Perkins and others as well. So it's a really interesting link through time. But on my mother's side, I very much connect to another culture, being that sort of post immigrant situation where people from war-torn Europe came after the Second World War to Australia, and they almost didn't quite make it, in that it was the only ship to have sunk en route to Australia. And so again, this sort of blended heritage is certainly part of my story, and something that I acknowledge certainly both sides of my heritage. But interestingly enough, there is also a further connection through my stepfather being having direct lineage to the first colonial architect of Australia, being Francis Greenaway. And so that becomes a really interesting, I guess, going full circle from the first colonial architect to one of the first Aboriginal architects to be registered in Victoria. And so I often describe myself through the three A's. So firstly, I'm an architect. I'm trained as an architect, established an architectural practice over 20 years ago now. And very much it's centered around people, purpose and place, and looking at opportunities of how we can actually intersect with culture, intersect with place, and intersect with Indigenous knowledge systems as a way of informing design thinking. I also wear another hat as an academic, and so since 1998 I've been teaching into the design stream at the University of Melbourne. But my current role at the university is as a lecturer in curriculum development. And so what I'm actually tasked to do is indigenize the design degree across 12 design disciplines, and to Indigenous perspectives, knowledge systems and sensibilities into design education. And so that, I guess, is a really pivotal move in terms of really foregrounding Indigenous knowledge as informing the way we think about design education. So that I think is certainly a new way of thinking as it relates to design practice. And the final A is as an advocate. And so along with Ruben Berg and myself back in 2010 now, we established the only peak design body that represents Indigenous design practitioners across a range of different design disciplines. And what we realized when we first met was that there was very few of us. So we really wanted to find a mechanism to empower Indigenous voices, to mentor and role model practitioners coming through, but also to engage with the design profession to demonstrate the value of Indigenous knowledge in shaping our places and spaces, and also to communicate back to Aboriginal communities the value of good design as enabling their aspirations to be realised through design thinking. And so that's really an important part of the story as well. So I'd like to take you on a little bit of a journey in terms of design practice from my sort of perspective, but also with a series of provocations and case studies to really illustrate some of the key points that I'd like to talk to. So this particular quotation, I think, captures it really nicely. If nothing of your culture, history, language, or art is visible in the streets, parks and buildings where you live, how can you ever feel welcome there? And I think there is a new sensibility and understanding that Indigenous perspectives into the cities and towns and regional centres and across this vast continent is actually important. And there is I guess, a reckoning to understand how we actually go about that. And to that end, we realise, and I think intuitively understand, the value proposition of why it is important, but importantly, the challenge really is, how do you implement it and how do you translate that into meaningful design action? And so hopefully through this presentation, I'll be able to give you some clues and some ideas and some methodologies which we employ through practice to really unpack some of these broader challenges. And I start with a provocation. And the first provocation is really having a sense and an understanding of what is the current state of play. And really, if we think about it, whether it's across regional centres in Shepparton and major propositions that are starting to come to the fore and being considered as part of reshaping significant spaces and places across our country, whether it's through boring through terra firma, through large infrastructure projects, whether it's very large infill projects in a city and across our vast country, or whether it's starting to utilise and transform existing networks to gain back public open space, or significantly looking at pre-existing heritage sites which have significance. And this here is the Queen Victoria Market site in Melbourne. Is how do we actually navigate this thrust towards development and transformation of our cities, and how do we do it in culturally responsive way? But I think we should really pause and understand that in reality, if we think about it, all such projects are built on Aboriginal lands. And I also naturally acknowledge Torres Strait Islander lands off the mainland as well. And so if we think about in the context of Victoria alone, it is actually made up of over 38 distinct language groups. And so within the greater metropolitan and regions of Melbourne is made up of 5 distinct language groups, being the Dja Dja Wurrung, the Tanarong, the Woiwurrung, the Boonwurrung, and the Wathaurong. And so what that talks to is that diversity. But there are also shared sentiments and ideas, but there is also that diversity of different topographies, different landscapes, different languages, and different cultural practices. So there is not a one size fits all. And certainly this idea of understanding the landscape and the country that you're undertaking project is certainly a significant part of the story as well. And so I would argue that the time really is now. There is a really strong pivot to understand how we can actually engage with the socially complex environments of Indigenous culture across the globe. And we're seeing this in the media every day. We're seeing on the back of particularly the Black Lives Matters movement of how we're starting to challenge some of the difficult truths of some of the past histories of some of the figures of history which are actually being complicit in holding back Indigenous voices and agency into shaping our cities and centres and places across the globe. And so this, I guess, is a means for pause and contemplation to see what is the role and the contribution of architecture as being complicit, particularly in the colonial story and conquest of often places which have a very deep history. And so certainly what we're starting to see is a shift. And the shift has actually been occurring for a number of years now. Many people may not be necessarily attuned to some of the changes which have actually occurred over the past 5 to 10 years, but it has actually been happening. And so whether it's significant markers in the landscape like the Tunaminaway or Malbohina Memorial in Melbourne, which is actually a marker which talks to the colonial interface of the 2 first publicly executed men in Melbourne, being 2 Aboriginal men related to Truganini. And so this is an important signifier for some of those difficult stories. And it's one of these propositions which blends landscape, urban design, public art, with a strong cultural backstory, which seeks in a very sort of nuanced way to engage with some of these stories. Equally, we're seeing in other propositions, both ephemeral and permanent, are starting to grapple with some of these questions. So whether it's the work of Sibling Architecture, where they've enveloped an obelisk, which is essentially saying, etched onto the stone that Batman, when he so-called discovered Melbourne, that there was no Indigenous people or that there was terra nullius, in fact, in place. So it challenges by enveloping and using language to start to ask the questions. And similarly, the work from Edition Office, which is certainly really embedding a collaborative model of Indigenous voices with non-Indigenous design practitioners to really demonstrate a sort of co-design collaborative model through design. And so also we're starting to see some other propositions and interventions which are really starting to engage in quite compelling ways to really unpack some of the difficult stories and the contested histories that reside in place as well. So there is a marked change in the rhetoric and the conversations that are starting to be had. But it also begs a bigger question. In Victoria, for instance, we have legislated for treaty conversations. There are conversations around developing truth and reconciliation at a broader scale, embedding a voice to really unpack through a First Nations assembly some of those difficult conversations. But equally, universities are starting to grapple with these questions. So architecture schools are starting to confront some of these bigger thematics as well through design teaching across the globe. And similarly, we're seeing that the design profession is starting to step up. So whether it's through the Institute of Architects, which have implemented a First Nations advisory working group and cultural reference panel, whether it's the Planning Institute of Australia endorsing the Uluru Statement from the Heart, whether it's the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects embedding a reconciliation action plan. So you can see that there is this market shift starting to happen. And equally, if we sort of reflect on this quotation, design creates culture, culture shapes values, values determines the future. So what essentially I'm interested in is looking at the underscoring philosophy and ethical position and values that inform the way in which design occurs. And so moving on to the second provocation really is asking the bigger question of who are the gatekeepers of heritage? And if we think about it in the context of how heritage works within the built environment professions, we have instrumentalities and statutory authorities and gatekeepers like Heritage Victoria. We have heritage overlays, we have heritage advisors, we have the National Trust, we have heritage consultants, we have cultural heritage management plans. But you know, whose heritage are we in fact protecting, and when does heritage start and stop? And often when we talk about heritage, we're thinking of it in the terms of built form heritage. We often don't consider landscape heritage, cultural heritage, intangible heritage. And if we step back a moment in time and understand that there is a degree of sophistication and originality as it relates to Aboriginal culture. And you could argue, for instance, that the first stone engineers, the first architects, the first landscape architects were Aboriginal people. And so if we look, for instance, in Wurdi Youyang, on Route 2, Geelong, near Mount Rothwell, is a constellation estimated to be about 11,000 years old, which maps the solstice. And it's often seen as by Wathaurong people as equivalent to a sort of Stonehenge type significant site of great meaning and depth and understanding of country. And if we look further afield, southwest of Victoria, about 3.5 hours from Melbourne, down Portland Way, is the Budgebim cultural landscape, estimated to be somewhere in the order of 6,600 years old. And what that cultural landscape demonstrates is permanent settlement of Indigenous people creating architecture, stone houses for estimated to be somewhere between 400 and 1,000 people, using the volcanic eruption and the lava stone to create permanent housing, but also sophisticated aquaculture system to channel eels and aquatic life to feed and to really understand the landscape. And so I remember going down to this country during winter, and it was blowing a gale, and you could see how it was carefully orchestrated and calibrated to shield yourself from the prevailing winds. But equally, there are contemporary representations of Indigenous culture here in Redfern, in the heart of Sydney, are very much a magnet for Indigenous people within the heart of a major metropolis. Then, as I mentioned before, treaty legislation passed in Victoria begs this bigger question of how does the built environment disciplines need to change and adapt to meet this new reality on the horizon? And how do we become future ready and mobilize to understand that practice will change once treaty is ratified? And so how do we do that? How do we start to meet this very compelling question of, responding to this particular provocation? And so, we certainly need to acknowledge some of the difficult truths, but equally we need to move beyond the cliches, the stereotypes, the kitsch representations of Indigenous culture as a sort of default positioning. We need to understand that there are some challenging conversations that will be revealed through such a proposition. But equally, what we're starting to see is an assertion of the power of Indigenous creativity. There is a number of really compelling Indigenous designers out there who fly under the radar, but which are undertaking some terrific work. And they straddle all the design disciplines you can think of, from architecture, landscape architecture, interior design, furniture design, planning, statutory planning, archaeology, fabric design, jewelry design, industrial design, graphic design. And so these are the sort of names of the people that we should know about. These are the Indigenous people who are engaging with design. And so this moves me on to the fourth provocation of what role and how can practice become an enabler for culturally responsive design. And so over the best part of the last decade, we've been working on an initiative. And this is an initiative that has taken us around the globe. And it's foregrounded Indigenous voices. We've listened to Indigenous custodians and knowledge keepers and traditional, people to understand the importance of First Nations perspective into design thinking and how to be culturally respectful. And it's resulted in what's known as the International Indigenous Design Charter. And so this has certainly been recognised within the design disciplines, but importantly, this has also been a collaboration. This is a true collaboration between Deakin University, the Design Institute of Australia, and Indigenous Architecture and Design Victoria. And what it seeks to do is essentially step through and pressure test one's own processes of how one can understand the realities that Indigenous culture is a deep culture, and that we can't necessarily assume that by engaging with culture that we can speak to custodians and assume that we can hoover up Indigenous knowledge and claim it as our own. So what we've essentially done is develop these protocols to really step through how to be culturally respectful and responsive. And so they raise a whole host of different and compelling questions and methodologies, which are often not considered or foregrounded through design practice. And so just to highlight a few of those, Indigenous-led, where possible, if Indigenous voices can be at the table as key contributors and become an important voice in the realisation of projects which engage closely with culture, we will therefore have a degree of cultural authenticity embedded through the journey. Equally, deep listening is a really important element. So for instance, we often talk about this notion of the need to park the ego at the door, because invariably when we're engaging on country with traditional custodians, we as designers are often the least knowledgeable people in the room. We're actually reliant on Indigenous knowledge in order to bridge the cultural divide, to really understand some of the nuances and sensibilities that might seek to be embedded and woven into a given project. But equally, we need to understand the contribution, the role and the impact of design. But also we need to think about some of the moral considerations and the legal issues that need to be considered through cultural property rights, for instance, intellectual property rights, moral rights. These are all considerations that are often not thought about when we engage and collaborate directly with Indigenous people and projects. And so what I'd like to really do now is step you through a couple of case study projects to really illustrate how some of this thinking actually informs design practice, and the methodologies that often we employ to really unpack some of the opportunities that reside in engaging with culture as a formative means of design inspiration. And the first project I'd like to touch on is the Koori Heritage Trust located at Federation Square, the beating heart of Melbourne, if you like, the cultural hub of Melbourne. And so it is certainly a significant project on many levels. And so if we look at a sort of a cultural mapping exercise, we realise that even in a major metropolis like Melbourne, that culture, stories and connection to Indigenous experience still exist to this very day. So whether it's, for instance, a series of river red gums, which are estimated to be 400 years old, located on the university campus at Melbourne University, whether it's Aboriginal skeletal remains, which are located on the Queen Victoria Market site, which was the old cemetery of Melbourne, whether it's Aboriginal skeletal remains, which were repatriated and located near the Botanic Gardens. But there are more contemporary expressions of Indigenous identity, whether it's the Tunaminaway Mulbohina marker, which I showed earlier, whether it's an important gathering place, a fig tree located adjacent to Melbourne Museum, whether it's the Black Mile, as it was known, which was the part of Fitzroy where a lot of the important places and gathering connections for the Indigenous people located in Melbourne, or whether it's where the MCG is located, which was always a gathering place for Indigenous nation, being the Kulin Nation. And so you can see that we can concrete over country, but country still exists. The stories still remain in place. And so the Koori Heritage Trust used to be located on King Street. And so this was a three-storey warehouse, a sort of a 19th century building which was repurposed for a cultural keeping place and a very important gathering place for Indigenous people. And so you can see through this map that it was located on both the literal and figurative fringes of the city. And so when they sold their building, they managed to get an opportunity to be co-located within the beating cultural heart, the artistic heart of Melbourne, being the cultural precinct there at Federation Square. So that raised an opportunity. And importantly, there are a number of moments that sought to be brought across from the old facility into the new. And so this image here, I guess, captures quite powerfully some of the stories and some of the narratives that are embedded. So the image on the left-hand side is a scar tree. The image on the right-hand tree was the equivalent of a scar tree embedded within an existing building of the old Koori Heritage Trust. The circulation preambulated around this scar tree, this important cultural marker. Importantly, we also see on top of the scar tree is Bunjil the eagle, the creator spirit of the Kulin Nation. So as you traverse vertically through this building, you are being protected. But importantly, the community were really invested emotionally within this particular artifact within the building, and they wanted to bring it across to the new facility. The image on the left is in fact a scar tree on the Wimmera River, about 3 hours west of Melbourne. And so what you see there is something which really talks to a metaphor of sustainable practice. So for instance, you don't cut down the tree to remove the bark to make a canoe. You only remove that which you need. So it's a sustainable practice. The tree remains intact. You can harvest further bark for a kulamon or for shelter or other means. But also, it provides shelter for fauna. You can harvest the sap for medicinal purposes. But also, over time, that scar grows back. So it becomes a reminder of time. So this tree may well be, 150, 200 years. So the closer that slit grows together, the older the tree is. And it tells us a little bit about time. but the sustainable metaphor is really important. So there was a desire to bring that tree across to the new facility, but what a lot of people didn't realize was that it was in fact a casting of a scar tree from the Wimmera River, wrapped around a steel armature, and then hand painted. So it's an artifice, but it is evocative to an understanding of culture. So we employ a strategy of adaptation through design practice as the mechanism to stretch through time. And so First Nations people from Turtle Island in North America often talk about the 7 generations as they frame an understanding of culture. So they talk about 3 cultures before the current culture and 3 generations into the future. So you're really looking at 7 generations of thinking. And so really starting to solidify an understanding of the impact of what we do. And so the image on the left is a shield, hand carved by William Barrick, a significant Wurundjeri elder. The image in the center is a dendroglyph, or a carved tree. So these were dotted from southern Queensland all through New South Wales into northern Victoria, but they are most prominent on Wiradjuri and Kamilaroi country. And Kamilaroi country is my country. And what they signify is important places of great importance. So for instance, burial sites of significant elders, or corroboree grounds, or gathering places for Indigenous people. And so you would see the carvings within the scar of the tree. And so what we sought to do through the Koori Heritage Trust was to create a contemporary reinterpretation of the dendroglyph, or the carved tree. And these are dotted within the constructed landscape of the interior of this particular building. And so you can see these cultural motifs become echoes of memory and understanding of culture. And so we spoke previously about the scar tree in the old Koori Heritage Trust facility. And so we sought to really echo that understanding and the connectedness. So we sought to create a new version of that scar tree. And so we came up with this idea of the gathering table. So this is a bespoke piece of joinery which are located within the center of the cultural institution, and it echoes the idea of a canoe. It contains some of the cultural collection of the Koori Heritage Trust. It has a series of drawers to enable you to engage closely, to move beyond the sort of white-gloved approach to the museumization of culture, if you will, and different heights. So little tackers can reach it and engage with it. And at that one end, we have a cantilever of about 1.4 meters to facilitate equity of access for an understanding that a lot of Indigenous people and elders are in wheelchairs, so facilitating that consideration as well. And so what we really sought to do was sort of invert the importance of important business around this table to speak to each other, to engage eye to eye, and to gather and connect and to speak and to really facilitate conversation. And so we can see the execution of this in its finished result. And so what you can see here is what used to be the old thoroughbred racing museum at Federation Square, and then it became the Lego museum, and then the it's had so many different versions, and it was kind of the sort of the ugly duckling within the cultural heart of Federation Square. But now that missing link has been filled to really center the importance of Indigenous culture and deep history. And so this collaboration between Indigenous Architecture and Design Victoria and Lions Architecture really facilitated a new way of thinking about what used to be a very vanilla white building. It was whitewashed walls, white ceilings, even white tiled floors. And so what we did is we peeled back the whiteness and we started to bring in a color and texture and materiality. And we ground back the suspended slabs akin to Wash River pebbles. We located the gathering table, the canoe table, within this landscape. And then to divide space, we created this sinuous mechanism to house the cultural collection of the Koori Heritage Trust, which has something like 60,000 artifacts and paintings and photographs as an important keeping place. But importantly, the glazing, which enables you to see through in behind the inner workings of a cultural institution. And importantly, the staff who sit in behind this cultural collection are enveloped by the collection of which they're the custodians and the protectors of. So they're reminded each and every day of the important role and contribution that they play in upholding the importance of culture through this important gathering place. And so what we also sought to do was to reposition a cultural narrative of a water story. And so this building runs directly parallel to Birrarung, or the River of Mist, better known as the Yarra River. And so we reorientated so you could view and open up and connect to that river story. We pointed and orientated the gathering table towards the Yarra River, knowing, for instance, that there used to be a waterfall which was dynamited out in the 1890s to make way for a bridge. That was a natural crossing point for the Boonwurrung people of the south of the river to connect to the Woiwurrung people north of the river and traverse across this basalt ledge and which separated the saltwater from the freshwater. And so you can see again in the ceilings this sort of reference point and directional understanding and orientation of the importance to this lifeblood of any community being a significant watercourse, the highway, if you like, of Aboriginal Australia pre-contact. But importantly, this is a place of gathering, of connection, of exhibition and showcasing and celebrating culture. And so that's certainly a really important ingredient in our design practice, is to orientate ourselves towards a celebration of culture, moving beyond the deficit discourse around the problematization of Indigenous culture to really look at opportunities to embrace and share culture, to celebrate culture, to understand the sort of shared humanity of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country. And so understanding this idea of adaptation, often we try and embed subtle, nuanced approaches to cultural ceremony and practice. And so here we see Uncle Max Dalamannaman Harrison, a Yuin elder, when I attended the Glen Murcutt International Masterclass. And so this is an ancient tradition of a smoking ceremony where we're welcomed onto country. And often we'll use the eucalypt, often the manna gum, as the leaf that is burnt to then smoke people and to protect them as they enter country. And so what we see here is an image of the blossom of the manna gum. And so that became the sort of mechanism to really embed in a very subtle way an acknowledgement of a traditional practice, being the smoking ceremony and the welcoming ceremony. And so this then became a sort of a graphic as a way of signifying, as you cross the threshold into the Koori Heritage Trust, that you were in fact being invited, protected, and that a traditional and ancient culture was actually celebrating and embracing people to start this experience, this cultural exchange at the Koori Heritage Trust. And so you can see these little moments and this mechanism of using cultural adaptation as a means to really find a way in and to embed and infuse within the DNA of the design thinking a cultural story. And so I'd like to move now to the second case study as a way of really, again, illustrating the different ways to think about design through a cultural and Indigenous lens. And so this project is known as Nagara Place. Nagara means fire. And so fireplace is certainly really looking at, again, at that sort of ceremonial intersection. And this is at RMIT University, the city campus in the heart of Melbourne. And so the genesis of this idea really stemmed around the conversation of the 6 or 7 seasons of the Kulin Nation. So again, it challenges some of those default positionings around adopting other cultures into a different context in the Australian experience on Kulin Nation, where one presupposes that the 4 seasons of Europe necessarily apply to the explicit experience in Kulin Nation country. And so that really started the conversation around how we thought about this particular project. And so The Nagara Centre is the Indigenous unit of the university there at RMIT. And so what we really sought to do was to find different moments to really centre the importance of ceremony, of connection, of culture, and of normalising an experience of Indigenous connection, within a university. So what it obviously enables is a degree of knowledge exchange or a pedagogical or learning landscape. We wanted to be loud and proud and bold and quite engaging, and we wanted to really centre the experience as well as part of what this proposition sought to do. And so really sort of building on that, we wanted to use a palette which drew upon the bioregion that the project was located on. And so then exploring and connecting to those 6 or 7 seasons, and there's still disputation even among Kulin Nation elders of whether it's 6 or 7 as we start to unravel some of those connections through time. And so what we also wanted to do was to embed an engaging proposition which started to understand that the small proposition within this broader university campus could start to broaden the conversation beyond its immediate location, which was but a small footprint of about 80 square meters. But also what we really wanted to enable was cultural experiences and an authentic connection to culture through the project. And so this was a collaboration between an Aboriginal architect, an Aboriginal landscape designer, and an Aboriginal artist. And so one of the other domains that we really wanted to explore was the plant palette that we use. So we wanted to use edible plants, medicinal plants, plants used for weaving and other utility. And so this really became something that explored both form and color and texture, and also very much connected explicitly to its place. So this notion of connecting to country. And then what we also wanted to do was to engage boldly with color and to signify that this is actually a slightly different place from the sort of institutional experience of a university campus. And so this next image really sort of captures it. This was just a very simple diagram to talk to the, I guess, the aspiration and intent. And so as it happens, as a backdrop to this particular space is a glazed facade. And we said, well, wouldn't it be great if we put a bold, loud and proud piece of Aboriginal contemporary art as a backdrop, as a way of saying, well, this is a place that is a little bit different to the rest of the campus. And so this placeholder image was something that the university embraced. And they said, well, oh, can we have that piece of art? And so what started as simply a placeholder actually evolved into a proposition which we therefore needed to engage directly with the artist to say, well, can we in fact seek the cultural permission to use this piece of art? And so you'll see here the diagram in the center talks to this idea of these radiating arms as a way of sort of signifying a broader urban design strategy which starts to reach out to the adjacent proximity to other places, to talk to the sort of segmentation of this sort of landscape intervention with the sort of centrifugal force of the fire pit as a key moment, and then starting to look at graphic motifs as a way of starting to connect to culture. And you saw some of those images of the dendroglyph or the carved trees. And again, this sort of motif is sort of embedded and emblazoned within the concrete through a sort of pigmented concrete and sort of grinding back the aggregate to really sort of reveal this sort of cultural connection. And then looking at starting to zone a series of further stories embedded through the landscape itself, and then starting to link it through this idea of a backdrop or the public art offering back to the city. And so I think this particular image captures it quite nicely. And what I particularly like about this photograph is that you have William Barrick, the Wurundjeri elder, overlooking the space and in a way sort of protecting this country by overseeing and embracing this relationship, being the portrait building by ARM. And so this, I think, comes full circles. It relates to explicit connection to Wurundjeri or the Kulin Nation, but also signifying that the university is doing something a little bit differently. And then as we started to progress and evolve the project, it started to take on a different sense as well. And so you can see the tiered seating is really about the sort of performative nature of culture, and starting to understand that, these moments of pause and contemplation within the hustle and bustle of a very sort of busy city-based university campus. And then what we also embedded here was, this idea of connecting to country, of sort of biophilic design, of understanding the different role and contribution of different species as signifying further stories, of the proposition of embedding interpretation through pedagogical panels, and then etching into the fire pit these cultural motifs. And then you'll see on the left-hand side of this image a series of seats. So elders are given prominence. So if they are visiting the university and coming to talk to students, that they take on a prominent role. And then this graphic motif folds up and over that sort of tiered landscape that's been created through this sort of amphitheatre. And then, simple things like embedding PowerPoints and charging points for your laptop and your mobile phone. So it's sort of blending contemporary with also an understanding of some of the traditional ideas which are informing and infused within the design thinking as well. And so you can see how, while it's a very small little proposition and intervention, it actually signifies much more than the actual dimensional scale of the project. And so again, you can see how we're really centering the importance of ceremony through the fire pit. We, in fact, exhibited this project at the Venice Biennale in 2018. And you can see how that sort of celebration of art and culture as well. And so we often talk about in the context of this notion of cultural expression. And I would argue that architecture is just another form of cultural expression. And often we tend to think of the only form of cultural expression through an Indigenous lens is pictorial art. But I would argue architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, interior design, fashion design, furniture design, jewelry design, they are all forms of cultural expression, and they just happen to manifest themselves in different ways. But importantly, what we also seek to embed with all of our projects where possible is to infuse language. And so we know that with the diminution of language, we lose a connection to culture. And so this idea of infusing and normalizing a bicultural experience by embedding language, by translating, by facilitating interpretation, by enabling a degree of knowledge exchange becomes an important part of it. And so telling these stories, infusing a cultural narrative is certainly something that we seek to do. So we created this graphic as part of the interpretive panels, and you can see in the next image of how this manifests itself through this direct engagement with people. So it's very much a people strategy. It's really centering the importance of story and of connection. And so you can see on the right-hand side, Wurundjeri elders coming to the university at the start of the academic year to welcome people onto country as a signifier of the importance of this knowledge exchange that occurs and that traditional practice that occurs through the smoking ceremony. Again, a really important part of embedding and facilitating a normative experience to Indigenous culture. And we know that universities across the globe are becoming much more globalized, and we have a lot of international students. So what better way than to have an authentic experience of the place in which you study than to engage directly with over 67,000 years of history and wisdom through your educative experience at a university. And so this image for me really encapsulates it quite well, because what we're seeing here is how this space is used. It's about engaging, it's about story, it's about connection, it's about cultural exchange, it's about celebrating culture, it's about generosity of spirit, it's about a moment of pause and understanding, and a cross-cultural dimension within a learning environment that a university is. And so for me, this is is really gratifying when we see how the places and spaces that we work with are used. And so that is really what it's all about. It is about that ability to amplify an experience with people, using the tools of architecture, interior design, landscape design as the mechanism to become that enabler. And so, importantly, this notion of connection to country, of story, becomes a really important motif. And I think there's certainly a huge desire for the profession to start to pivot towards a new level of acknowledging and engaging with culture in ways which ideally start to foreground the value of Indigenous knowledge, but also facilitating opportunities around what we often call reciprocity or mutual benefit. And it sort of takes me back to a story of a conference I went to recently, where we had some elders from East Arnhem Land, and they put it in these terms. They said, we often get universities coming and bureaucracies and government coming to our community, and they'll come to our community and they'll squeeze the orange and they'll take the juice. And then they said, but what are we left with? And it really raised this bigger question of how do we facilitate mechanisms where there is that shared benefit, and that there is in fact true collaboration, and that Indigenous knowledge is not seen as a commodity to be exploited, but a means and a way in to understand this deep connection to over 3,000 generations of knowledge and understanding of country. And so to that end, I'd like to leave everybody with a series of, I guess, reflections and key sort of takeaway messages. And the first one really is the importance of acknowledgement. Acknowledging and understanding the country and the cultures in which you're engaging with. And while we're centering explicitly here on the intersection with indigeneity, this applies equally in other cultures. And understanding, for instance, that everyone is Indigenous from somewhere. So Indigenous people, First Nations people exist across the globe. But importantly, where we engage with First Nations understandings and connections, invariably we will reveal, we'll unpack and peel back the layers of history and memory. And so that is part of the journey that one goes on when we start to intersect closely with Indigenous cultures. Equally, what it will raise in many respects, particularly in the Australian context, is we will reveal and engage with some difficult truths. And we do know that the colonial story has reached far and wide. And so consequently, we don't avoid these difficult truths. We embrace that as part of the collective experience of that sort of cultural dimension as it relates to design practice. But importantly, the notion of foregrounding Indigenous voices is really important. So as we could see through the International Indigenous Design Charter, this notion of Indigenous-led is certainly an important ingredient, particularly if we accept the premise that all projects located in Australia are located on Indigenous lands. And so it provides not only an opportunity, but the stimulus for design inspiration. And it does remind me of a quotation from Uncle Max Dalamannaman Harrison. He said something quite profound when he was taking us through country, Yuin country. And he said, you've got to give it away to keep it. And what he meant there was we need to facilitate and pass on knowledge, otherwise it will be lost over time. And so importantly, I have one caveat to that really profound note, is that ideally it is done through the auspices and with the cultural imprimatur and permission of Indigenous people. And so to end, I'd like to say Maru Yania, or go well, and thank you for your time. And as I understand, there will also now be some opportunity for questions as well. Thank you. So I think you're on mute, Katie and Robbie, if you...
Thank you so much, Jefa. I really enjoyed that. It was thorough and very delicately handled, and it's really interesting to hear your perspective and for you to go through everything so carefully for us. We've had a bunch of interaction from the audience. I'll go through a couple of questions that we had to just start us off now, if you like. I think, if you don't mind, just popping off your share screen there, we'll just go into the little bit of a chat. So I'm going to start with one question, which is, what suggestions do you have to students who want to engage with Indigenous Australian culture without crossing into cultural misappropriation? Does this start with connecting to our local Indigenous communities?
That's a terrific question, and it's a question which I think a lot of students have, particularly because we know that the optimal way to engage is to engage with traditional custodians where possible. We know within the constraints of a university course or a design studio of 13 weeks, we're often constrained and there's limitations. But it starts with curiosity. And I would argue that a lot of it actually comes back to having skin in the game. And what I mean by that is building one's own level of cultural intelligence to really build the resources, the language, and the capabilities to engage, often with a culture that many don't interface or have much of an experience with. And so certainly where there's an opportunity to have a conversation with Indigenous voices, that is certainly going to be preferred over having no connection or opportunity to engage. But we also know that particularly traditional owner groups are bombarded. They often have limited resources and capability to meet all the demands. They often have statutory obligations to engage in particular ways for projects, but they're often not given the funding, the recurrent resources to support that requirement. So there is certainly some challenges in terms of limited capability within Indigenous-led organisations and traditional owner groups and the like. But certainly, there is so many resources out there these days that one can draw upon, building that understanding and reading widely and doing the background research, trying to understand and connecting in the first instance to the country in which the given project might be located is certainly a terrific starting point. And even incidental conversations can also be helpful. So, and so these become really good starting points. But I think certainly it's about individuals going on a bit of a learning journey. And it's an ongoing journey because ultimately, if you haven't engaged with Indigenous culture before, where do you start? And certainly it's trying to find a way in. And naturally, the purpose of something like the International Indigenous Design Charter was really a way to step through and consider some of the sort of mechanisms to engage in respectful ways, but also to demystify it. Because ultimately, for me, it's about starting to shift a little bit away from walking on sort of cultural eggshells and to engage in a spirit which starts with respect and deep listening, but also understands that there are ways of working and building some of those ethical positions of how one undertakes design practice.
So do you have any suggestions as architecture students who, where we study in an environment or with programs that within which like the cultural narrative is not really at the forefront? Do you have any, so you're talking about now Indigenous communities not necessarily having the funding or ability to kind of speak directly. Do you have any suggestions about kind of establishing more celebration or facilitation of like the like you said earlier, the normative experience of Indigenous culture in our own study, like in the program at university, or is it just more about the conversation and as a student, you know, bringing it up and approaching it in our course?
It often starts with a question, and the question can be as simple as, is there an Indigenous story that could be told here? And if the answer to that question is a yes, then that starts you on that journey of discovery, and where one does some research and starts to try and unpack what that means. And I think the importance really stems from personalizing the experience. So understanding what it means to you and how to actually develop the tools and the language to engage with the complexity and the sensibilities that may exist, but also to develop ways to build capacity around research and having elements to really explore what that means. And for me, it often comes back to having that ethical or philosophical position of, if it's deemed to be something that is important, how does one go about it? And how do you shift from that sort of subtlety between appropriate and appropriate? Spelled exactly the same, but there's a real nuance in language there. And so it's understanding the implications of assuming one can sort of hoover up Indigenous knowledge or motifs or imagery without getting the requisite cultural authority to proceed. And so that's why in design practice in industry, such things as the charter become helpful. But as one engages through our sort of learning journey of university life, one can actually build some of those skills along the way and really look at understanding some of the layers that exist.
Okay, thanks for the lecture as well, Jefa. I've got a small question for you. The Black Lives Matter movement currently shows a lot of public support for the Indigenous culture in Australia. However, do you feel that there's some hesitation from what is essentially white Australia in not wanting to appropriate Indigenous culture? So there's a little bit of a fear that we're maybe stepping on toes rather than really expressing ourselves in trying to support Indigenous culture?
Well, I guess my perspective is we all live, work or study in Australia. Therefore, it presupposes that to be culturally respectful, that one can't sort of avoid the conversation or not seek to engage with it in some way. So it's the starting premise is really finding the mechanisms of how to do it. And so design can also only do so much. There's often this sort of sense that design is the silver bullet or the panacea to solve all difficult conversations and propositions as it relates to Indigenous culture's intersection with design practice. So in many respects, it's really understanding it in a holistic sense. And so that often means that one employs a broader way of looking at the proposition. And I would argue that in many respects, it's about stepping through a number of different stages. And so, where possible, yes, one would certainly engage with Indigenous culture by having a direct conversation with traditional custodians and the like. But, we can also be inspired by, we can also understand that importance of connection to country. We can also acknowledge diversity of different countries, and that if we're doing a project in Victoria, that the Indigenous community that one might engage with there may be completely different in its mindset, in its cultural practices, in its language, in terms of its country and topography and the like, to working in another state, for instance. So one certainly needs to build the tools and mechanisms of how to step through it. So for instance, I equally need to go through the same steps. So as you saw in my introduction, I explained who my mob was and where my country lies and heritage exists, which is northwest New South Wales. So when I'm working here on Kulin Nation country in Melbourne, where a large proportion of our projects are located, I equally need to find a way in. I need to build mechanisms to understand and connect to the culture in which I'm working with. But equally, one of the most important elements of that is moving beyond a transactional model to a relational model. So it's about building relationships. And we often talk about, when it relates to engagement, of 1,000 cups of tea. So it's not a case of sort of flying in, meeting up with the community, lobbing in for a day and thinking necessarily that one can answer all the questions, solve all the problems, fly out again, and it's done and dusted, and we'll take whatever we've heard on that given day and we can nut this project out, no problem, sort of thing. And equally, we want to sort of get to a point where we move beyond the assumption that you can hang a dot painting in a foyer and think the Indigenous aspect of the project is done and dusted, or in essence sort of saying that it's not a graft on, it's not a sort of a surface treatment or the sort of muralization of culture, but it's embedding it within the design thinking. So I think one of the challenges is that many people assume that you can simply, look at some books and look at some Aboriginal art and be inspired by it, and then sort of use that as a sort of like a bowerbird of picking elements and then sort of grafting that onto a project. It's understanding it and having those conversations to understand what is the essence of what we're seeking to do to engage with Indigenous culture into a given project. And ultimately, the permissions lie with traditional custodians. They might say, well, actually, we don't see an opportunity in this given project. We don't think there's a possibility where we can make a meaningful impact, for instance. And say you've got a degraded industrial site and it was a factory and it's riddled with contamination and so on and so forth. Can you realistically impact in a meaningful way in that project? So it's not for all projects, certainly. But I think what's starting to occur now is a sensibility for the profession to find ways where it's at least considered within the mix. So for instance, if we think about site analysis, we go to an understanding of what's the solar path, where's the prevailing winds, what are the views and vistas, what's the topography like. But equally, we can ask within that sort of analysis, that sort of mapping of an understanding of country is, what country are we located on? Is it Wathaurong country? Is it Wurrung country? Is it Jajawang country? That then will take you in a particular direction if that's deemed to be an important consideration for a given project, and will certainly unlock potential and opportunities. And then once you have a conversation, then it may lead to further opportunities. So you can see it's treated in a multifaceted way rather than a sort of a compliance-driven model. It's a values-based approach to design thinking.
Just to follow up on that as well, do you come across cultural appropriation often? And how easy is that to spot?
Well, I guess it's you can see how a project is explained. So sometimes you can see where it's seeking to simply tick a box. And so often we sort of talk about this idea of looking at a project through the lens of what are the values and the principles and the ways of working of where we might seek to engage with culture. And certainly there is a sense sometimes that I would love to engage with Indigenous culture on this project. And I ask typically 3 questions. I ask, who have you spoke with? How far along the journey are you? And what are the key design principles that have embedded an Indigenous prospect or opportunity in this project? And often the feedback comes back something like this, and we've heard this many times before. Oh, well, we haven't spoke to Wurundjeri yet, or, you know, fill in the gap, whoever the traditional owner is. Oh yeah, we've documented and we're starting construction in 2 weeks. And oh, that's why we're talking to you now. We'd like to start to embed an Indigenous story into this project. And then we sort of say, we thank you for your interest and desire to engage in some way to Indigenous culture in this project, but you can see there might be a sense that this is being tokenistic, that you're seeking to embed an Indigenous opportunity after the fact, and that there may be a sense that this becomes quite superficial. So where it becomes really powerful is the earlier you have these conversations. So if you haven't done a single drawing on a page and you have a conversation, then the opportunity is broad and can be very impactful, and it can infuse very deeply into the project. And so often when we have these sort of conversations, we'll say, yeah, that's a terrific idea, but maybe this project has probably gone too far down the track for you to meaningfully be able to engage with it. But other times, when we broker a conversation with the traditional knowledge keepers, they might say, well, actually, given the prominence of this site, or given the scale of this project, there could still be an opportunity, although they've gone some way down the track in the journey of how far they've progressed the project. And so they might say, well, actually, what if we did X? And so it's ultimately for the traditional knowledge keepers to define the interest and the level of engagement that they may seek to have with a given project, dependent upon when the conversation is orchestrated. And so often we as practitioners become almost like a cultural interlocutor, or a facilitator, or a conduit between the traditional owner groups and the project. And often we'll put it in terms that sort of reframe it around a sort of a cultural understanding, because often we get caught so much in our own sort of jargon that we don't actually disseminate clearly and succinctly what we're actually seeking to do, which may resonate with the community that we're engaging with. So we often need to therefore pitch it to the audience that we're speaking to. But ideally, it becomes a co-design exercise where Indigenous people have a seat at the table and are meaningful contributors, and they lead the conversation and define the ways of working to engage in a manner which will provide that reciprocity or mutual benefit as well. So that's a certainly important ingredient in projects that we undertake.
So when you're talking about being a facilitator, this question kind of speaks to that a little bit. Deanna asks, how would you go about a situation where the area is on country that might be disputed between different Aboriginal nations? Have you ever come across that before?
Always. There are so many, well, I guess to take a step back, what we're actually trying to do when we engage with traditional owner groups, recognise Aboriginal parties, land councils and the like, is we're often confronting the reconstruction of the disparate strands of a pre-colonial experience. So the sort of blunt instrument of traditional owner group arrangements, native title, recognise Aboriginal parties is trying to remediate some of the lost connections. So it's a residual effect of colonisation. And so the traditional owners are still grappling with some of the actions which have impacted on the natural flow and connections and understandings of the demarcation of different countries. And so as a result, there often is disputation around where the line is drawn, if you will. And so you'll see in the Aboriginal map of Australia, there are no straight lines like the states and territories of Australia. They often respond to and flow and connect to watercourses, mountain ranges, the topography of country. And so as a result, there are places, the city of Melbourne is still not fully defined in terms of recognition of a recognised Aboriginal party per se, because some of those negotiations are still in train. So our approach is we often define and develop Indigenous engagement strategies to really look at the front end of how we're going to enable a meaningful conversation, mindful of some of these socially complex environments that we work within. And our approach is to be even-handed, to not take sides, to embrace all, and not to necessarily get caught up into some of the sort of the political machinations, and trying to come in as a sort of an honest broker to hear everybody and find a pathway through and see where some of the shared visions and aspirations might be in a given project. And so that way we can often navigate some of those tensions that might exist, and that's a reality. But equally, we see in projects which may not interface with Indigenous culture, there can be tensions between different levels of governments, for instance. And so if we think about in a treaty conversation where we're moving to developing sovereign relations, then the ways in which design practitioners work with Indigenous people will therefore need to shift and modify to meet that new reality. But it's certainly something that we grapple with all the time. And it goes back to building respectful relationships, because it's connecting people with people.
Jefa, do you think it's possible to honour Indigenous culture through architecture in instances where the environment's physically being replaced with a built form, considering Indigenous culture values, conservation above all else? And how can that tie in with sustainable design as well?
Well, I would argue that Indigenous people were the first ecologists here on this country. So I think inherently there is a synergy between a connection to country and sustainable design practice. Secondly, I'd be also wary of the assumption that one can't be unashamedly contemporary in their construction of Indigenous identity, because the reality is 80% of Indigenous people are urbanised. They live in our major cities, towns and regional centres. So that is the reality, this sort of default sense that necessarily Indigenous people are living in remote and rural experiences and environments is actually not the reality. So also, Indigenous culture is a lived culture. It's constantly changing, adapting and evolving. You wouldn't have lasted on this harsh continent for 67,000 years without that ability to adapt and change. And so contemporary connections to culture is also part of the story. And we often think about and default to a sort of a stereotype about Indigenous equals the past, or Indigenous equals primitivism, or often we'll say Indigenous people used to such and such. But I like to sort of pivot that to say, well, how do we actually create new artifacts through design culture and design practice? And so every bit of marking on the landscape is creating a new artifact, a new story, a new cultural narrative. And so, in 200 years' time, a project that we work on today may be seen to be a significant cultural site of significance to the community, for instance. And so when we think about an artifact, we often think about artifact equals a sort of archaeological sense and a sort of anthropological mindset. But I would argue that everything that we do as design practitioners has the potential to create a new opportunity around creating, space, landscapes, and so forth. So design is just the mechanism or the tool to get there. And therefore, particularly if we have the cultural authority to proceed, we can actually come up with some really engaging, compelling projects. And certainly the idea of sustainability is simply the ancient tradition of caring for country. And so we often get caught up in the sort of the ideological mindset of left-wing, right-wing politics and the sort of contestation around sustainability. But very few people can argue with the premise of seeking to care for country, leaving it better than when we started. These are propositions that we all have a role to play in. We know we have finite resources. We know that we're invariably manipulating the landscape to suit human occupation. But make no mistake, Aboriginal people across this vast landmass manipulated the landscape for human habitation. Traditional fire practices, sophisticated aquaculture systems, permanent housing settlements, agriculture. These are all things Aboriginal people did pre-contact, so we have certainly groomed the landscape to facilitate the way in which Indigenous people sought to live. But we did it in a way which was holistic and integrated and understood the interconnectedness of everything, that it wasn't sort of segmented, and we didn't seek to commodify country in the way in which we're doing more and more these days. So I think there is a reckoning. We're seeing through bushfire, floods, all the things that are happening within our landscape. It's Mother Nature fighting back, telling us that we're doing it wrong. So there's a lot of wisdom that resides in Indigenous knowledge, which can start to remediate some of those challenges.
I think that's a nice segue into another question here. This one's, you covered it slightly. I was thinking you might be able to tie it in a different way. So this is from Jeremy, who says he's an architecture student. And he asked, do you feel that design disciplines are a colonial introduction? And if so, what do you believe is their role and capacity? And I know you've just touched on this kind of the influence of design and how you can incorporate things. So I was wondering if maybe you could tie it back to the cultural relationships in your more contemporary works, maybe of your practice. So the ones that may not be immediately identifiable to the public as maybe the typical First Nations design and how they respond to culture in a more modern way, like you were mentioning.
Yeah, certainly. Well, yeah, I like modernist architecture like the next person, really. We're all Aboriginal architects are invariably trained within a Western construct of what architectural design practice and pedagogy is, and in the Australian context. There's a move towards indigenizing design practice, which is starting to percolate through. And so, as you can see in my role at the University of Melbourne, it's certainly looking at ways to embed Indigenous perspectives, knowledge systems, and sensibilities in design education. And it's certainly fair to say that architecture inherently, particularly in a colonial settler society, was used as a colonizing device. And so the imposition of built form on other people's country and this notion of terra nullius has certainly conspired and facilitated a power dynamic that excluded Indigenous people. And so in many respects, a lot of the work that we do is really trying to make the invisible visible and also to find ways to celebrate culture. And so it's moving beyond the deficit discourse to really say that it's something that one can very much embrace as part of our shared experience. So if you look in, for instance, the New Zealand experience of a sort of an acceptance of a bicultural normative understanding of culture. So where non-Maori will learn language at school, where you have dual signage and language in the cities and towns across the country. And so in some respects, that is my sort of broader ambition, is to provoke a conversation to look at how we might start to shift our mindset to that end. And equally, designing a contemporary home for somebody when it's done by an Aboriginal architect, you could argue it's Aboriginal architecture, although the brief defined by the client may not be so explicit, but it can infuse it with a particular sensibility, for instance. So something that I'm very interested in sort of the honesty of tectonics. So really understanding how buildings fit together, and the sort of frugality and simplicity of a sort of construction methodology which reveals itself and isn't sort of hidden beneath plasterboard and facade systems where you don't actually get to understand the mechanisms and the language of tectonics. And to that end, for instance, as best as I know, that there is no word for architecture in any Indigenous language. There's no word even for art, but there will certainly be words for mark making or painting, or and a lot of them also respond to sort of the narrative and the use of language which connects explicitly to country. So it might have allusions to landscape in some fashion. So you can see the sort of sophistication of language is saying, well, we don't segment or silo cultural practice from other forms of practice. And so that is, I think, an important distinction in the same way as sort of linear time, where we often think more in sort of circular time. So it's cyclical as opposed to linear. And so when we talk about connections, we often reference past, present, and future simultaneously. And so you can see it's a different sort of worldview which can actually bring a different perspective and consideration in design practice. So these are all quite compelling questions, but in some respects, we're still grappling with it ourselves. Because if you think about it, the natural evolution of Indigenous culture was disrupted. So in essence, sort of in a sort of post sort of colonial experience, we're trying to reconstruct those sort of colonial connections and do it in ways which also embrace our contemporary reality. So to that end, I'm quite comfortable in being unashamedly engaging and contemporary in the way in which our design is executed. It doesn't have to play to a particular stereotype. And I guess sort of moving beyond what Dylan Combo-Mary calls the sort of sticks and berries approach to Indigenous architecture. We've kind of moved beyond that. We're certainly looking at much more sophisticated ways to engage with it. And, and the moment you start to shift from sort of exploration of a colonial mindset, I prefer to sort of looking at it more in the sense of it indigenizing rather than decolonizing, because it shifts the power balance and starts to demonstrate that there is Indigenous agency in this whole exploration.
That's really, it's a perspective that I don't hear often as an architecture student, kind of like the understanding that, Indigenous and First Nations culture has a place now, and it works interchangeably, not interchangeably, in conjunction, like connects to other styles and other architectural forms and things that don't have to be stereotypical. I think it's a great thing to hear as a student. And I was going to ask, so in terms of our overarching theme for all of our speakers, which is sustainability, our environmental, cultural, and social obligations, what would you define if you had to do a little summary of our obligations? I know in your PowerPoint you had some nice little dot points there, as our obligations as architects kind of in our society. What do you think our obligations would be if you had to term them?
Yeah, well, I like the fact that this lecture series talks to sustainability in a multifaceted way. I think the problem has been in the past that we see sustainability purely through a sort of mechanized response to environment and using sophisticated technology as the device to mediate the challenges. But for me, I think the key responsibility is to understand and acknowledge that sustainability is multidimensional, and it brings in a range of different elements. So everything from health and well-being, on social sustainability, of individual responsibility, of obviously a consideration of the finite resources and the true sense of being considerate and responsive to the challenges around climate change, for instance, and biodiversity loss. These are just normative practices which are just a no-brainer. That we never speak about sustainability in the sense of starting to remediate the challenges of heat loss and gain and all the sort of technological sort of approach. That's just a given. That's just a working practice that says, well, of course we have to be sustainable. Of course we have to care for country. That is just the ways of being. Like that's not even a thought. That's just a given. And so consequently, I think it's really pivotal for young practitioners to understand that we work within a social contract, and it comes with certain obligations and responsibilities. And therefore, how do we build up our skills and capabilities to meet that challenge and reality as a practitioner, and that there is a compelling need to shift the way in which we've practiced before to move towards a sustainable model, which enables us to consider the multifaceted approach to a people-centered approach to design practice. And in some respects, consider the role of our own ego as often an inhibitor to be responsive to some of those bigger questions.
Great. Okay. I think we'll make this the last question. Jefa, do you have any specific suggestions on contacts, websites, or places where people can begin having conversations with their local Indigenous culture if they're wanting to engage them on any project, or even just learn any more about their local culture?
Yeah. If every student of architecture across the 19 schools of architecture across the country contacted their local traditional owner group or land council, they would be inundated. So it starts with the personal, and I think it starts with building out what I call cultural intelligence, and knowing that we're all on a learning journey. And so I think there are ample resources out there to draw upon. So, if you think of Bill Gamage's work, or Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, or there's a terrific book called Voices, which is an Indigenous-led publication called Voices, Indigeneity in Architecture, which was entirely conceived, executed by Indigenous people, Indigenous publisher, Indigenous editors, Indigenous writers, all trained as architects or Indigenous academics in the built environment. These are terrific resources out there. And, I guess the beauty of reading and researching and, engaging with texts which are by Indigenous voices is it's unmediated. You're hearing it directly, unfiltered, and therefore that voice comes through authentically. So where you can actually draw upon Indigenous people's desire to share knowledge through publications or podcasts or websites and the like, they are a terrific starting point. And certainly there are many non-Indigenous practitioners who are engaging with some of these complex questions as well. We all have a role to play because there's just too few Indigenous practitioners out there who have the capacity and the time and the resources to respond to the myriad of questions that naturally exist. So I think personalizing your own understandings and building your own capacities and awareness is a terrific way to start. and that feeds into the curiosity, which I know is out there, and there's a huge appetite, and it's only going to increase. There's going to be much more engagement in this space, because I think there is a tipping point that's starting to occur right now, and we're right in that sort of moment in time where it's really going to become just core business as part of design practice. Brilliant.
Thank you so much, Jefa. That was excellent, very eloquent, and then well spoken, and sort of it was brilliant to hear from someone, like you said, that's an Indigenous but also contemporary practitioner, all about like our cultural history and the communities and architecture and design's role. And I'm sure we're all going to walk away with reflecting on our own cultural intelligence and awareness. I'm looking forward to engaging with myself. So once again, I'd like to thank Jefa for his time this week and joining us here in the third real lecture of the series. Next week, we have Kim Irons from Irons McDuff coming back. So if you want to tune in next Tuesday night, we'll have her on, and you can send in questions early as well if you like. So from the whole real lecture team, thanks to everyone who joined in tonight and for all the questions. If we didn't get to you, sorry about that. We're really excited to just continue bringing this series to you online, and hope it gives you a little bit of engagement in your digital studies. Thanks a lot. See you next time.
Thank you.